So welcome. My name is Donald Spector, professor of physics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, but here today in my role as president of our local Phi Beta Kappa chapter, known as Zeta of New York. I'm pleased to welcome all of you who are attending. Students, faculty, and staff here at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, community members from Geneva, New York, HWS alums from all over, and assuredly others as well. And with a special shout out to our HWS Phi Beta Kappa alums who have taken the time to be here today and whom we are pleased to connect with at a Zeta event once again, even if only over Zoom. Our speaker today is one of this year's Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholars. As America's leading academic honor society, Phi Beta Kappa is a champion for the liberal arts and sciences, academic excellence, and freedom of thought. As part of that mission, in 2.5 weeks, we will have the honor of inducting our newest HWS student members, many of whom are here today. Our chapter, Zeta of New York, is marking a milestone few chapters have reached. This year is our 150th anniversary. As part of our sesquicentennial celebration, in which we seek to embrace Phi Beta Kappa's motto, "Love of learning is the guide of life," we are pleased to be able to host today's speaker for this important lecture and discussion, as part of his 2-day virtual visit to our campus. This visit has been organized by my colleagues in the economics department, Professors Christina Houseworth, Josh Greenstein, Soo-Young Lee, and Judith McKinney, and I thank them all and hope you will take the time to thank them as well. It is they who have made today's event possible. With that, let me introduce my colleague, Professor Judith McKinney, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my enormous privilege to introduce Douglas Massey, the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I won't talk for long. I am a firm believer in short introductions, and those of you who would like a more detailed description of Professor Massey's distinguished career, his awards, and most recent publications will find more information in the chat. I was planning to list his full bibliography, but that would have taken far more space than we had. But I do want to take a moment to express my personal pleasure at welcoming Professor Massey to our campus, even if only virtually. I first became acquainted with his work about 15 years ago when I was developing a course on the economics of immigration, and a colleague recommended Professor Massey's wonderfully readable and deeply disconcerting book on Mexican immigration, Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, Mexican Immigration in an Era of Economic Integration, a compelling exploration of the unintended consequences of public policy. Later, I discovered more of his works on immigration, including an article, The New Immigration and Ethnicity in the United States, which wove together several of the themes that have distinguished his work over the years: immigration, segregation, public policy, social stratification, and mobility. Today, we have the privilege of hearing Professor Massey speak on many of these same themes. The title of his talk is Race, Segregation, and Inequality in the United States, a topic that is unfortunately still as timely today as it was when he published the article on the new immigration a quarter of a century ago. Professor Massey, the floor is yours.
Okay, my topic today really focuses on, let me get rid of the pictures here. I'm going to talk about the trends, causes, and consequences of residential segregation today. I've studied segregation since 1977 and written widely on the topic. My most best well-known book is American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, which was published in 1993 with my colleague Nancy Denton. And this was a contribution to what was then the ongoing underclass debate. After poverty rates had fallen for many decades, they suddenly stalled out in the 1970s and 1980s, and they became particularly obdurate in inner city Black neighborhoods. And this spawned a debate about whether we were building a permanent underclass. And at the time, the debate was really between figures on the right, like Charles Murray, who blamed it on the welfare system, and figures on the left, like William Julius Wilson, who said it was the restructuring of the urban economy. But neither the right nor the left seemed to pay any attention to the fact that the United States was a very racially segregated country, and racial segregation just might have something to do with the perpetuation of poverty. So he made this argument in the book, and I think it did change the terms of the debate, because no one can now ignore segregation as a problematic feature of American life. But I'm not going to recap what we did in the book. I'm going to pick up the story and bring it into the future. So since publishing the book, I've done a lot of work and published a lot of papers. I haven't published a second book yet on segregation. That's on my agenda. But I've written a lot of papers on the changing basis of segregation, on segregation in post-civil rights era America. So I'm going to go through recent trends based on some of the work I've done. I'm going to focus mainly on two indicators of segregation. One is the index of dissimilarity, which is the degree to which Blacks and whites are unevenly distributed across neighborhoods in a metropolitan area. And by neighborhoods, I'm referring to census tracts. They're small units of local geography of about 4,000 to 6,000 people, and they correspond roughly to what people think of as neighborhoods. So the index of dissimilarity gives the percentage of Blacks who would have to exchange places, neighborhoods with whites to achieve an even residential distribution, where Blacks are evenly distributed across neighborhoods. The other index I'm going to use is called the isolation index. The isolation index is basically for African Americans. It's the percentage of Blacks in the neighborhood of the average Black person. Obviously, as that percentage goes up, Blacks become more racially isolated within the neighborhoods they inhabit. So they're related but different indices and tell you different things about the nature of segregation. So what I have here is Black-white dissimilarity at different geographic levels: states, counties, cities, and census tracts. Back in 1900, as you can see, Blacks and whites were segregated from one another at fairly high levels, irrespective of the unit used. 95% of African Americans lived in the rural South, in the South, mostly in rural areas, and most whites lived outside the South. And so they were segregated, Blacks and whites were segregated at a regional level and at a county level and within cities as well, although that was actually the lowest of the three. What changed over the course of the 20th century was the Great Black Migration, during which time thousands of Blacks, millions of Blacks moved out of the South and into cities throughout the country. And by 1970, around half of all African Americans lived outside the South, and the vast majority now lived in cities rather than rural areas. So you can see what happened as the migration proceeded. Levels of segregation at the state and county level went down, especially at the state level. Still, there's some segregation at the county level. And as they moved into cities, segregation in the cities actually grew and went up. And that peaks around 1970. And then the Civil Rights era comes. The Fair Housing Act is passed in 1968, which outlaws discrimination in housing. In 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is passed, which outlaws discrimination in mortgage lending. And in 1977, the Community Reinvestment Act is passed, which outlaws the practice of redlining, color coding neighborhoods according to their credit worthiness and assigning the color red invariably to Black neighborhoods, which started in the 1930s by the federal government. Beginning around 1950, the data become available to look at segregation across cities at the municipal level. And prior to 1950, there were no major cities that were predominantly Black. There were a few small towns or small places in the South that were Black, but no cities. And what happened in the course of the migration, of course, is that Blacks poured into cities while whites poured into suburbs from 1950 to 1970. And so you see segregation at the municipal level rises and peaks about 1980 and stays there through the year 2000. And it hasn't changed much since then. And this is important because now this is segregation across financial boundaries. Municipal boundaries are financial districts, taxing districts. So you're separated on the basis of things other than simply sociality. You're located in different fiscal areas. So it's a fiscal segregation as well as a social segregation. This just repeats the analysis with Black isolation. You see the same trends back in 1900. Blacks were isolated in southern states and in southern counties. And then over the course of the 20th century, they migrated out. Those levels of segregation went down, and isolation within neighborhoods went up and then started going down after the Civil Rights era. And isolation at the municipal level also increased. Same basic pattern. When we published American Apartheid back in 1993, some critics said we were exaggerating. We weren't like South Africa. The United States was not that segregated. Eventually, data became available from South Africa, and I was later able to calculate segregation indices for South Africa and the United States. So these are average levels of segregation across metropolitan areas between blacks and whites in the Union of South Africa. And so you see, over time, segregation in the United States is rising, and segregation in South Africa is rising. Apartheid comes into being right in the late 1940s as an official policy, and then the increase accelerates, and it continues beyond the U.S. levels once the United States hits the civil rights era and it starts to go down. So for a lot of U.S. history, South African history, our levels of segregation actually were not that different from one another. So this takes up trends in neighborhood level dissimilarity, residential dissimilarity, the first segregation index I described from 1970 to the present. And this is an average across 287 metropolitan areas. It's a weighted average by the minority population for each group. So it's the weighted average across blacks for black segregation, the weighted average across Hispanics for Hispanic segregation, and Asians for Asian segregation. So it's the segregation experienced by the typical metropolitan resident in the year in question. So you can see back in 1970, when only 2 years after the Fair Housing Act had passed, blacks and whites were really quite highly segregated in cities, almost an index of 80. So 80% of blacks would have to change neighborhoods with whites to achieve an unsegregated or even distribution. And then that fell at a clip of about 5 points per decade over the next several decades to now it's 60. And 60 is normally considered to be the threshold for a high level of segregation. Anything above 60 is considered a high degree of segregation. Indices between 30 and 60 are considered moderate segregation, and indices below 30 are considered very low levels of segregation. So blacks have come down, but this is an average, so there's still a lot of blacks up here and there's still a lot of blacks down here. So there's still a fair amount of segregation in the world, in the country, as we'll see. And despite the huge growth in both the Hispanic and Asian population, their levels of segregation didn't go up that much. They inched up a little bit, so they're kind of at the higher end of the moderate range of segregation. And this is quite different from what happened to Black Americans as they poured out of the South and into American cities. As they moved into American cities in the course of the first half of the 20th century, they experienced ever higher levels of segregation as their populations grew. And it's only since the Civil Rights era that they've come down. This repeats the analysis for the index, the isolation index. And here you see the effect of a massive increase in the Hispanic and Asian populations. Even if you keep the residential distribution at the same level of evenness, as the neighborhoods that contain Hispanics and Asians fill up with other people coming in, the levels of isolation will increase. So because blacks were not increasing in cities, the black migration was over, and black immigration hadn't really taken hold until really in the 1980s and 1990s. Levels of black segregation went down fairly steadily until Hispanics and blacks meet around 2010 at about the same level of isolation, which is means that the average Black and Latino person lived in a neighborhood that was 45 to 50% Black or Latino. Asian isolation also rose, but it stayed very low. Asians in general are not very isolated in American urban areas. Now we talk a lot about minority segregation, but in point of fact, the really segregated group is whites in America. This looks at the the top line shows the white isolation index. So you see that back in 1970, the average white person lived in a neighborhood that was 91% non-Hispanic white. And that slowly trended down, but it remained at a fairly high level. You can see that as of 2010, the average white person still lived in a neighborhood that was about 75%, 3/4 white. And they and these are contact indices, which are the opposite of isolation indices, and they're very unlikely to come into contact with Hispanics, Asians, or blacks, and especially blacks. So those are the trends, and let me talk now overall segregation. So let me now talk about suburbanization and segregation in the United States. Whites are overwhelmingly suburbanized. Even in 1970, about half of whites lived in suburbs, and that's gone steadily up, though at a declining rate, until in 2010, the last census, it was about 63%. I can't even read it because I'm in the way there. 63% suburbanized. No other major ethnic group has a majority living in suburbs, and Hispanics and especially blacks are still more or less confined to a great degree in central cities. This looks at levels of segregation and isolation in central cities versus suburbs. So these are central cities versus suburbs and the index of dissimilarity. So you see back here in central cities in 1970, they were very highly segregated, and that's come down to about the threshold of high segregation here. We see more or less the same for Hispanics. They go up, and they're fairly highly segregated in the moderate range. Asians are much lower. And if we look at suburbs, we see that back in 1970, blacks were still highly segregated, though not as extremely segregated as in central cities. They're highly segregated. And over time, that's come down to now they're in the high, moderate range rather than the high range of segregation. And Hispanics and Asians also are close by in suburbs. So suburbs have become much more diverse, and levels of segregation for blacks in particular have gone down into the moderate levels. And this looks at isolation indices, which basically shows the same patterns, only the increase in Hispanic isolation is much more obvious in both places. And this is because in 1970, Hispanics were only 4.7% of the population, and today they're 18% of the population. And in 2000, they overtook African Americans to be the largest minority. So their numbers increased, and that perforce increased their isolation within neighborhoods that they were found in. This looks at segregation by levels of income. So it's the segregation between blacks in different income quartiles and whites in any quartile. So it's the degree of racial segregation by income. And you can see Asians were somewhat highly segregated back in 1970 and 1980, but over time, these have all come down. These are the indices for 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and they've all come down, and they're about in the moderate range. This is Hispanics. Back here, we have problems with measuring Asian segregation because they're small numbers here, and even though they're about 7% of the population now in many cities, they're still small, and that tends to inflate. Segregation indices. But the thing to look at are dissimilarity indexes for Hispanics start at the border of high levels of segregation, and there's always been a strong decline in levels of segregation as income rises from the bottom quartile, the second, third, fourth, top quartile, the top 20% of the income distribution. But the thing to note is that for blacks, segregation remains fairly high, and it doesn't. In 1970 and 1980, income had no effect on segregation. Then suddenly in 1990, there is an effect, and there's a good big improvement owing to the civil rights legislation. But then the decline stalls. And as of 2010, the most affluent African Americans were more segregated than the poorest Hispanics, which tells you a lot about the state of race relations in the United States. And the right side just does the same work with isolation indices, which tell the same story in a slightly different way. Now, when Nancy Denton and I were studying segregation based on the 1980 census, we noticed that, when we began our work, there was a big argument in the field about how to measure segregation, and there were some 25 different indices proposed. And so we wanted to bring some order to all the indices. So we did a factor analysis. We found out that the indices loaded on 5 basic dimensions of segregation. The 2 of them we've already discussed, which are evenness and isolation index, the dissimilarity and isolation index. The others are clustering, the degree to which black neighborhoods cluster together tightly in space, concentration, the degree to which blacks occupy a small portion of the urban environment, and centralization, the degree to which Blacks are concentrated towards the center of metropolitan areas, the inner cities, where it's older housing stock and less advantaged conditions. And we see, and we discovered that in a subset of metropolitan areas, Blacks were segregated on 4 of these 5 dimensions, highly segregated with indices above 60 on a 0 to 100 scale, highly segregated in 4 of the 5 indices. And we called that hypersegregation. And back then we were only studying the top 50 metropolitan areas, so we really didn't know how many there were, but we identified a subset that were hypersegregated. Now, because of the availability of digital data, we can measure segregation across all metropolitan areas. So in retrospect now, we know that around 1970, there were 40 hypersegregated metropolitan areas. And by 1980, that didn't change much, or between 1990. And then it starts to go down. And now there are only 21. But within those 21 areas, this is the average segregation across all 5 dimensions. Segregation is still very high. So hypersegregation persists in America. And this shows trends in segregation and isolation within hypersegregated metropolitan areas. Only a handful of Hispanic areas are hypersegregated, and basically Los Angeles and New York and a few other places where a lot of Afro-Caribbean Hispanics concentrate. And in those places, segregation and isolation have been going up. And then in Black hypersegregated areas, they've gone down, but everything is still very quite high. So high levels of isolation and high levels of segregation. And this is the configuration as of 2010. About a third, these are 14% were hypersegregated on 5 dimensions and hypersegregated on 4. That's about a third of all urban metropolitan African Americans live under conditions of hypersegregation, and more than half live under conditions of high segregation with at least a dissimilarity index above 60. And a little less than half experience moderate segregation, and very few experience low segregation. So this focuses on America's most segregated cities. These are the metropolitan areas that are segregated across 5 different geographic dimensions of segregation. So you see Cleveland and Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, Flint, Baltimore, Birmingham, Alabama, and St. Louis. And you can see that there's very little movement towards an integrated distribution in places like Cleveland and Chicago and Milwaukee. And they're staying very much up in the high levels of segregation. So there's been minimal and sometimes increases in the level of segregation observed for these metropolitan areas. And these are the next most segregated areas. These are areas that are hyper-segregated on 4 dimensions. And here you see they're converging towards levels of segregation in the high range and not getting into the moderate range. So these are the most segregated cities in the United States. So let's move on to the causes. Those are the trends. And the causes are multiple. One of them is density zoning, and racism hasn't gone away. And first I'll present to you some of the factors that affect racial segregation and just list them. Then I'll go through some data to really show you that how this is true. So prejudice and discrimination haven't gone away, and they continue to be operating in urban housing markets and lending markets to promote segregation. In the post-World War II era, suburban density zoning became widespread, and density zoning was restrictive. That is, in suburban areas, restricting houses to single-family homes on large lots and banning the presence of higher density housing, row houses, or townhouses, or apartment buildings. And this drives up the cost of housing, many studies have shown, in suburban areas, and works as a causal force producing higher levels of income segregation and higher levels of racial segregation for both Hispanics and for Blacks. The age of the housing stock matters. Newer metropolitan areas where a big chunk of the housing was built after the Civil Rights era, after 1970, after the Fair Housing Act. The more housing there is built after the Fair Housing Act, the less segregated a city is. metropolitan area is. And class and racial segregation are intertwined. So places that have high class segregation, that also boosts racial segregation because of the income differences between Black and white populations. A military presence is has a potent effect on levels of segregation across metropolitan areas. The military is today the most effectively integrated institution in American life. It's a command economy. And in 1948, the commander-in-chief, Harry Truman, commanded that the military would be desegregated. And over the decades, it has been very successfully desegregated. It's the only institution where Black people routinely boss around white people on the basis of higher rank. And military places with large military bases, the bases themselves are not segregated at all. And off-base housing near the bases, it tends to be much lower, more mixed than in other metropolitan areas. The presence of a college or university also tends to reduce levels of segregation because colleges and universities have people, well-educated people that are more liberal in their racial attitudes. The degree of urbanism, the larger the city, larger the metropolitan area, the more segregated it tends to be. And the higher the minority percentage in a metropolitan area, the greater the level of segregation. And then finally, minority socioeconomic status matters. The higher the status of Blacks or Latinos, on average, the lower the level of segregation. So until recently, we couldn't measure anti-Black prejudice very well across metropolitan areas. We had surveys like the General Social Survey that asked a random sample, representative sample of adult Americans about their racial attitudes. But those samples are 1,000 to 2,000 people, and you can't break them down by metropolitan area to get metropolitan specific indicators. But now we're in the area of big data. So I used Google Trends to look at search frequencies on the N-word in different metropolitan areas, and places with Google Trends presented it on a 0 to 100 scale. And so places with a high degree, high frequency of searches on this epithet were colored in red here. Moderate levels are colored in yellow, and green are low, the lowest observed. And so you can see that interest in these racial epithets is prevalent in the South, as you would expect, but also in the industrial Midwest and in the Northeast, and fairly much less frequent in the West, and quite low actually in Salt Lake City, which is one place that's actually integrated fairly effectively over time. And this looks at the degree of segregation. So you see here, the dark blue is high segregation, light blue is moderate segregation, and low segregation is the green. And you can see that there's a rough correspondence between the anti-Black indices and the high levels of segregation. But this is just a visual. We'll come to the analytics later. For Latinos, we tried the same thing. We looked at various epithets for Latinos and didn't seem to come up with anything until we put variations on the term illegal alien in the search engine, and discovered that there was a lot systematic variance across metropolitan areas in the degree to which Latinos were considered to be illegal aliens. And we know from a lot of work that Latinos over the course of the past 4 or 5 decades have been increasingly racialized along the trope of illegality. With the rise of illegal migration after 1965, since the migrants were illegal by definition, they were criminals and lawbreakers, and hence a threat to America, really moving forward a demonization of this group. And you can see that this is, unlike anti-Black prejudice, it's concentrated in the West. And the highest observed is in Phoenix, Arizona, where Sheriff Joe Arpaio won election and became a popular politician for systematically targeting Latinos for immigration enforcement, and putting them in camps in downtown Phoenix and parading them down through the streets of downtown Phoenix with pink handcuffs and pink boxer shorts as an act of ritual humiliation. So it corresponds to reality. Unlike Blacks, we don't see a complete correspondence. We do see high levels of segregation in California, where the prejudice was, the searches were worse. But we see a whole concentration up here in the Northeast. And this is the difference between Hispanics in the Northeast and Hispanics everywhere else in the country. In the Northeastern United States, it's the only region of the country where it's not dominated by Mexicans as a majority, and the only region where Central Americans also are not very present. In the Northeast, it's dominated by Caribbean Latinos from the Caribbean, particularly Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, and they're Afro-Caribbean populations. And we know from a lot of work that when you break the Hispanic segregation in the Northeast down by race, Black Latinos are about as segregated as Black Americans. Mixed race Latinos are a little bit lower, and white Latinos look like other white ethnic groups. So it's another confirmation of the power of race within, not between, the Latino population and Blacks. So this is the analytics, and I'll ignore the right-hand columns. And this just looks at the prejudice indexes. We see there are very strong and significant effects. The degree to which density permits higher density housing, zoning regimes permit higher density housing, lowers segregation. The percent Black and the percent Latino drive up levels of segregation. The ratio of minority to white income, the higher the ratio of minority income to white income, the lower the levels of segregation, and a more modest effect for education. And affluent poor dissimilarity, as we noted, drives up segregation. The segregation increases with size of the metropolitan area, just the log of the population size. Here's the effect of the military population. The size of the military population has a negative effect. And then here's the median year of housing, the age of the housing stock. The newer the housing stock, the lower the level of segregation, which this basically is statistical evidence of the factors that I listed to you before. So now I want to talk about the consequences of segregation. And it turns out segregation played a big role in the American foreclosure crisis. We developed a model of foreclosures where basically we predicted total foreclosures or the rate of foreclosures by a vector of measures, segregation, and a vector of control variables with associated coefficients. And here's what we get with simple ordinary least squares. So the index of segregation for Blacks is a strong and significant predictor of both the degree of the degree of segregation on the dissimilarity index here. The degree of segregation, the isolation index, strongly predict the log of total foreclosures, basically total foreclosures. So, and then you repeat the analysis for rates, foreclosure rates, and you get the same picture Black segregation is somehow driving the rate of foreclosures across metropolitan areas. And when we look at the effect of segregation compared to other predictors, we see that Black segregation is among the most powerful predictors of the rate or number of foreclosures across metropolitan area compared to other things that you would expect: housing price variation, the subprime loan share, housing starts ratio, change in unemployment, and the credit score index across metropolitan areas. What's the causal mechanism here? The causal mechanism has to do with the invention of a new technology for lending, the advent of mortgage-backed securities, a kind of derivative where mortgages are used to back securities that are then sold to investors. So prior to the era of mortgage-backed securities, which started in the 1990s in Boston in the 2000s, if you wanted a mortgage, you'd go to a bank, and the bank would look you over and give you a mortgage, and then you'd pay back the bank. And if you got into trouble financially, you could renegotiate with the bank and maybe spread out the payments or make some kind of arrangement. But that all ended in the 1990s as mortgage-backed securities began to take over the financial industry. And here, what happens is mortgages are originated by mortgage brokers that have no financial stake in the mortgage itself. And then the mortgage brokers sell them to investment firms in Wall Street, like Goldman Sachs. And then Goldman Sachs takes the mortgages that are sold to it, and instead of receiving the payments, they create a mortgage-backed security. So they packaged the mortgages together to pay off bonds, to pay interest rates on the bonds and principal on the bonds that bondholders buy, and then receive the income from mortgage payments. So all the mortgage payments go into a computerized congregation of a collection of other mortgages of different risks. And they want, and the theory of risk diversification is you want to diversify your risk, so you back these securities by mortgages, some of which are risky and some of which are not, and you in theory control the risk. It didn't work out that way in practice, but this new technology created a situation where the number of mortgages was no longer constrained by the capital a bank had on hand, only by what the market for mortgage-backed securities could bear. And the binding constraint on the number of mortgages that can be generated is the creditworthiness, is not the creditworthiness of borrowers, not the number of borrowers, but the willingness of the market to bear, to take these mortgages. And creditworthiness of the borrowers is not seen as a major issue. Because subprime loans carry high interest rates, which produce higher returns for bonds, and they can be bundled with conventional loans to manage the risk, at least in theory. And this created a hugely profitable cycle. Mortgage brokers generated the loans, they immediately sell them to securities firms. The firms divide the loans into risk tranches, which basically mean wedges of a pie in French. And then they repackage the loan from different tranches into bonds that are sold to different investors. And the rating agencies give the bonds a AAA rating in the belief that risk is controlled by diversification. And they also have a moral hazard, since the people paying for the rating are the people who are putting together the bonds. So that if they don't get the rating they like, they'll just go to a different bond rating agency. So all these money's makers, all these actors along the chain make money while assuming no risk at all. The brokers, the securities firms, and the rating agencies. And even investors can manage their risk through what are called credit default swaps, which are basically insurance against a bond's failure. And this set off an intense search for borrowers. And in this context, formerly excluded clients became extremely attractive. The racial segregation of poor minorities created a natural market for subprime lending, with geographic concentrations of financially unsophisticated and historically underserved minority homeowners. By the 1990s and the 2000s, homeownership rates had risen somewhat for African Americans, and those people who had overcome the barriers to become homeowners had often owned the homes outright. And these Black homeowners could easily be identified through real estate records and be targeted for subprime lending by unscrupulous brokers. So segregation is linked to racially targeted subprime lending, creating a dual racially segmented mortgage market and controlling for individual neighborhood characteristics. The rate of subprime lending was significantly greater to Blacks and Hispanics. From 1993 to 2000, the share of subprime mortgages in minority neighborhoods goes from 2 to 18%. And minorities were significantly more likely to receive unfavorable terms with prepayment penalties, high cost ratios, and large rate spreads. And this holds at all income levels. And here we see similarity on the x-axis and the difference in subprime lending between whites and Blacks on the y-axis. So you can see that it's very clearly structured by the degree of segregation. Segregation creates an easy target for subprime lending because you can just blanket a neighborhood, a blanket phone exchange numbers with advertising and recruiting, and go door to door to recruit people into low interest loans. And the effect of racial segregation on segregation, we did our ordinary least squares analysis with what's called a two-stage least squares instrumental variable analysis. We basically confirmed that segregation that segregation was a driving force, a causal force behind the mortgage bust in across metropolitan areas. So our conclusion from that is that racial segregation was an important contributing cause of the U.S. foreclosure crisis, and the effect of segregation is independent of other economic causes of the crisis, and the explanatory power exceeds that of other factors hitherto identified as causes, such as overbuilding, excessive subprime lending, house price inflation, and creditworthiness. Segregation made mortgage bust more deeper and more profound than it otherwise would. And neither the number or the rate of foreclosures is in any way related to the expanded lending to minority homeowners as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act, which became a trope on the right wing in the wake of the mortgage meltdown. The story that they put out was that it was because banks were forced to make loans to undeserving African Americans that the mortgage crisis happened, when in fact it was private label securities, private securities that were doing almost all the predatory lending. So in another study we did, we took a case study of subprime lending in Baltimore, Maryland, and we got all this data from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act on borrow, loan, and tract level information and loan level records for two types of mortgages: the mortgage-backed securities, the private label mortgage-backed securities, and loans securitized by government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we looked at 2,526 loans to non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites in Baltimore during the period from 2000 to 2008, the boom of the housing boom and the mortgage boom. And then we looked at subprime lending and combined risk lending. Subprime lending was defined as an interest rate that exceeds the comparable U.S. Treasury rate by 3 points or more. And that combined risk loan was a high-cost loan that contained two of the following additional risk features: an adjustable rate, interest-only amortization, low or no documentation, a combined loan-to-value ratio over 90%, balloon payments, prepayment penalties, or debt-to-income ratio greater than 55%. And then we looked at the likelihood that people got put into a subprime loan or a combined risk loan. And then we looked into also the mortgage payment they made, and the likelihood that they entered foreclosure during the period of observation, and whether the home was actually repossessed during the period of observation from 2000 to 2008. So we have all this control. This is all the information that was actually on the credit applications. So we have everything that a loan officer actually saw, and plus census tract characteristics, neighborhood characteristics. And what you see here is that other things equal, that the fact that the borrower is Black, or the fact that the borrower lives in a majority Black neighborhood substantially increases the likelihood of being put into a subprime loan. And it also increases the likelihood of being in a combined risk loan. And as you go through and control for more and more things, everything on the mortgage application form and everything on the mortgage application form, plus the census tract, these significant effects persist. And Blacks are systematically channeled into high-cost, high-risk loans by virtue of being Black and living in a Black neighborhood. And then we looked at whether the borrowers entered foreclosure and whether there was a completed foreclosure and repossession. And we continue to look at whether the borrower is Black here, but we also put in the other risk factors: high cost loans and high risk loans. So so because Blacks are put into these loans, they, for that reason, experience a high likelihood of entering foreclosure and a higher likelihood of ultimately being repossessed. And this doesn't mean they were never repossessed. It just means they were not repossessed by the time we finished collecting the data in 2008. And even after controlling for that, the borrower being Black has an independent effect. So it's a double whammy for them. That's not the case for repossession, but this is a smaller numbers problem because a lot of the things were still tied up in foreclosure proceedings. And then we did a counterfactual analysis. So we asked, what would we estimated a model to predict what whites would pay and what white neighborhoods, people living in predominantly white neighborhoods would pay. And then we compared them to what Blacks actually paid in Black neighborhoods, what they paid for being Black. And we see that Black borrowers in Black tracts ended up paying a 6.4% more a monthly payment and $532 a year more. over the life of the loan from its origination date, that was totaled to $1,861, and over a 30-year mortgage, it would total almost $16,000. And notice that it's higher for private label securitized loans. That is, private originated by Wall Street mortgage banks rather than federal agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The discrimination was concentrated in the private sector, not the publicly subsidized sector. And being affluent was no protection. In fact, that was a risk factor. That's where the money was. Affluent people were more likely to own homes and be targeted for subprime lending. And so their interest rates were higher, their monthly payments were higher. The amount that they shelled out to the point we started finished observation was higher, and the potential point lost in the course of life of a loan was up to almost 20,000. And this takes the analysis further and looks at we look at the by comparing black borrowers and black tracts to white borrowers and white tracts, we see that the predicted probability of entering foreclosure was 9.3%, but in practice it was much higher at 17.3%. Take a drink of water. So, and if you carry it through, you see there's a difference, and then the total extra foreclosure filings for being black, the number of and the excess foreclosure as predicted, and the home equity threatened, and this is the total home equity that was subject to threat of foreclosure in Boston, in the Baltimore metropolitan area. And then the next one actually does the same analysis, but looks at actual foreclosure. So because of all this discrimination, about $2 million was sucked out of the black community in Baltimore, and that wealth was destroyed for black homeowners, and it was almost $2 million in the period we looked at. And then we assisted a civil rights firm in Washington, D.C. in their suit against Wells Fargo in cases in Baltimore and Memphis, Tennessee. And when they looked at our analysis, after stonewalling for a while, when they saw our analysis, they caved. But before they caved, they actually ended up going to court. And this produced a set of affidavits and testimonies about the lending processes that were going on. And so these are the banks that were sued and pled guilty. And 4 cases went to trial and created a discoverable set of affidavits about the lending process. Berkeley v. Olympia, Wells Fargo Bank versus City of Baltimore, Wells Fargo Bank versus City of Memphis, and Adkins versus Morgan Stanley. And Wells Fargo was the #1 subprime originator in the country in 2006 at the height of the subprime lending boom. So we did a content analysis. We randomly sampled deposition statements and testimonies stratified on geographic area to create a data set of 220 statements. This was not just Baltimore, it was nationwide. Then we subjected it to a systematic content analysis, and we had 2 coders code the text to see whether it indicated individual discrimination or structural discrimination. Individual discrimination was explicitly discriminatory acts undertaken by a biased individual, and structural discrimination was a process of procedure in which seemingly race-neutral behavior led to a discriminatory outcome. We also coded for potential discrimination, but almost everything was potentially discriminatory, so we won't pay much attention to that. The data coding was done by 2 of my collaborators, Justin Steele and Len Albright, and each coder coded the labeled text, the text as evidence present, evidence not present, or not applicable. And intercoder reliability across a sample of 22 tests was 0.86, so they agreed. Nowadays, if you were to do this, you'd probably do it with machine learning. But back then, machine learning, this was not that long ago, but back then, machine learning wasn't a ready technique that one turned to. So from this coding, we extracted a set of texts, and we found that 76% of the texts had evidence of structural discrimination. So here's a few examples of, these are quotes from the affidavits, from the depositions that were taken. So the question was, would your split be higher if the borrower paid a higher interest rate? And then the answer was, if the company made a little money, I would make a little more money. So there was an incentive to discriminate. The commission and referral system at Wells Fargo was set up in a way that made it more profitable for a loan officer to refer to a prime customer for a subprime loan than to make a prime loan directly to the customer. The trading desk also set the bid terms and purchase agreement terms for those. The trading desks were not working for some lone rogue. My wife will get the phone. I should have buried the phone before starting. The trading desk said it was essential to Morgan Stanley's business model to vest the trading desk with the ultimate power to buy loans regardless of their quality. Doing so maximized the supply of loans and created the cash flow. And I complained many times about what I thought were unethical or predatory loan practices that Wells Fargo was engaged in, and managers never took any actions to respond to my concerns. In my office, we morbidly joked that we were riding the stagecoach to hell. So that became the title of the article that we used to display this research. Most common were both individual and structural discrimination. So in one testimony, one deposition, the individual said, Wells Fargo management tolerated a culture of discrimination. Wells Fargo discriminated against minority loan applicants by not offering them better products, which had lower fixed rates and fees. Another technique would be to tell the customer the only way to get the loan closed quickly would be to submit it as a subprime loan. Wells Fargo loan officers also discriminated against minority refinance applicants by encouraging them to take out more cash on their home equity. By taking out more cash, the borrower would unwittingly increase the commission that the loan officer received on the loan, while at the same time eliminating the ability to qualify for a prime or an FHA loan. Elderly African Americans were thought to be particularly vulnerable and were frequently targeted for subprime loans with high interest rates. I remember one instance where an elderly African American woman who was over 65 could not qualify for the subprime loan that a credit manager wanted to put her into. So the credit manager convinced her to transfer the property title to her son so the subprime loan could be taken out in the son's name. It was the practice at Wells Fargo, where I worked, to target African Americans for subprime loans. It was generally assumed that African Americans customers were less sophisticated and intelligent and could be manipulated more easily into a subprime loan with expensive terms than white customers. I heard employers joking with one another about the race of the customers, saying things like, you know, that guy isn't so smart. Is it because he's black? The loan officers referred to subprime loans in minority neighborhoods as ghetto loans, and minority customers as those people with bad credit, those people who don't pay their bills, and mud people. I believe that Wells Fargo did not promote me for two reasons. First, Wells Fargo's management culture is white. Second, Wells Fargo management knew that I treated Wells Fargo customers well by offering to refinance them into prime loans and FHA loans when they qualified for these projects. So this was a black sales rep who was penalized, not promoted, because he wouldn't target the African Americans. Wells Fargo's also targeted African Americans through special events called wealth building seminars. I remember preparing for a wealth building seminar to be held in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is outside Washington, D.C., in Prince George's County, which is predominantly black. It was understood the audience would be virtually all black. The point of the seminar was to get people to buy houses using Wells Fargo loans. At the seminar, the plan was to talk about alternative lending. This was code language for subprime lending, but we were not allowed to use the word subprime. I was supposed to be a speaker at this seminar, but was told by the emerging markets manager that I was too white to appear before the audience. I was offended by these statements and complained to several higher-ranking managers about what had been said. The company did not respond to my complaints, and no action was taken. So you can see that as a consequence of segregation, blacks became victims of predatory lending in a way that whites simply never were. and that as a result, Black wealth was essentially wiped out in the course of the mortgage meltdown, and Black rates of Black wealth compared to white wealth, which were never very high, fell to close to zero. And a massive amount of wealth was extracted out of Black urban neighborhoods and transferred into the pockets mostly of white people in New York City who bought bonds and who self-insured those bonds against risk because they knew where they were rotten. People like the president of Goldman Sachs, who testified in the Senate that he thought it was perfectly legitimate business practice to sell a lousy bond that he knew was almost destined to fail and then hedge that bond by taking out a credit default swap, or to sell it short, that is, bet against the success of the bond he just sold to a customer. One final thing, I know I'm running out of time. We're also interested in the consequences for health. And Black and white levels of mortality are vastly different, and Black and white life expectancies are separated by a huge gap. And when you control for things like education and income, you don't get rid of the gap. And what we argue is that's because affluent African Americans don't get access to the same kind of neighborhood advantages that affluent white people and other groups do. And we use this model very quickly, that high rates of poverty and high levels of segregation produce concentrated poverty, concentrated disadvantage. And these affect health and socioeconomic outcomes through biosocial channels, through telomere length, and I'll tell you what telomeres are in a bit, allostatic load, which is overstimulation of the stress response to create a low overload of cortisol and adrenaline in your bloodstream with health effects. And it also, and now it turns out it affects gene expression. We know now because of epigenetics that you don't just inherit genes and they're duly expressed. You inherit genes and then go through life and they interact with an environment, and it's an environment-gene interaction that produces the gene expression. So here we're only focusing on telomere length, and telomeres are these green things at the end of chromosomes. They're chromatid pieces at the end of chromosomes that protect the chromosome in the process of cell division. Cells are always dividing in our bodies, and as they divide, the telomeres wear down. And as they wear down, they get less and less effective at protecting the integrity of the genetic information in the chromosome. And as people age, they wear down because cell division goes on and on and on. And that's why when you get older, things start happening in your body. The things start going wrong, things start malfunctioning, autoimmune diseases increases, tissue starts to deteriorate, and so on. It's basically a process of genetic aging. And what we argue is that even if you control for income and economic well-being, Blacks still inhabit much less advantaged neighborhoods than whites, and exposure to this neighborhood disadvantage, which often comes with violence and social disorder, prematurely shortens telomeres. And this is a discovery that was discovered by Liz Blackwell at UC San Francisco. She won the Nobel Prize for it. So in this analysis here, we look at controlling for socioeconomic background, and you see that Blacks, we see here, controlling for everything else, that neighborhood disadvantage has a significant negative effect on telomere length. And if you look at this is the linear effect of neighborhood disadvantage on telomere length. So this was a little study that we published recently. And basically what this argues then is that poor health is built into the Black biology from a very early age. This was a sample from the Fragile Family sample, which is at the time the telomere assay was done, they were in their 30s. So this is before physical health problems are manifesting themselves, but already at the genetic level, they are showing telomere attrition that predicts poor health in later life. And so that is probably an overly long discourse on the trends, causes, and consequences of residential segregation in the United States. And like a lot of people, I'm looking forward to the results of the new census, and we'll be sure to update the data through 2020. So at this point, happy to answer any questions, take any challenges, or accept any points of view.
Professor Massey, thank you so much for your comprehensive and in-depth talk. Really appreciate it. My name is Soo-Young Lee, and I'm at the Economics Department of HWS, and I am honored to be in charge of taking questions and address them to you. So if you have questions, please leave your name or your question on the chat message, or you could click the reactions button and click the hand emoji to let me know you have a question, and I will go to you one by one.
I see Darren has a question.
Yeah. To ask a question.
Old school hand raised there. I hope that's okay.
Okay, I'll take Darren's question first, and then I'll go to Scott.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Professor Massey. It was for a I don't want to say fantastic, but a very informative and depressing most times talk. I just came out of teaching my course called Geography of Garbage, which starts with a look at race and waste in the United States and some of the environmental justice implications. It was started by Robert Bullard's work. And my question to you on this is, can you talk a little bit about your preliminary observations of the pandemic and how that might be exacerbating housing segregation changes in the United States over the past year? I have my own non-economist. I'm a geographer by most recent degree, and sort of very interested in these spatial patterns. I grew up in the Deep South, for a little context, in Louisiana, and so much of this rings true with my personal and academic background. But very interested to hear what you have to say about the effect of the pandemic so far.
Well, I don't think the pandemic is affecting patterns of segregation to any degree yet. It's only been a pandemic for about 13 or 14 months. But the segregation is certainly affecting how the pandemic is manifesting itself in both Black and Latino communities. And we know that places that are segregated and socially disadvantaged are all plagued by serious health problems. You look at any map of the city of Chicago, for example, you see that the Black South and West sides have high levels of infant mortality, high levels of gunshot violence, high levels of autoimmune diseases, high levels of coronary heart problems, and some kinds of cancers related to the waste that you probably know all about. And the housing is also substandard and often crowded. And so ghettos become a potential super spreader, and a much higher incidence of infection is observed. And then because of the criminal justice system, African-American males in particular are channeled in and out of jails and prisons with some frequency. And I just reviewed a study that's coming out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at the degree to which cycling in and out of Cook County Jail predicted infection rates in Black neighborhoods of Chicago. And you go into a prison, and the prisons are really super spreader places. They're really tightly packed. They don't get treatment. There's high rate of COVID infection. And then when Black men are released into the Black community, they become transmitters. And in addition, of course, Blacks also work in service jobs that cause them to come into contact with people. So overall, they have a number of strikes against them, and they have much higher rates of infection than the white population does. And it's taking a harder toll in the Black community. And also because they all have a lot of pre-existing health conditions because of the circumstances they have experienced when they to that point in their lives, which are very disadvantaged. So I think the causal direction so far is working from segregation to health via higher rates of infection and death.
Thank you, Scott.
Oh, okay, thank you. And thank you, Professor Massey, that was incredible. This wasn't really the point, well, this was not a central part of your work, but declines in segregation seem to be associated, well, contemporaneous with changes in government policy. And I just wondered what you thought about the role of government policy and whether there was any effective role for government policy now, given where we are now.
Well, during the subprime lending boom, government was not doing its job in enforcing the Fair Lending Acts, the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. They were breaking the laws, and nobody has ever been held accountable. They've been sued in civil courts for financial fraud, but not for racist behavior that is illegal under the law. And while the firms have paid the price, no individual has ever been charged. And in fact, they got away with everything. More broadly, the price of passing a lot of America's civil rights laws was that enforcement mechanisms that were in the original legislation that was drafted were taken out. And the government was given very few tools with which to enforce the law on discrimination in markets. And so that a lot of the discrimination continued to occur afterwards, only in a surreptitious, more clandestine fashion that was not as observable as it was before because it could no longer be open, but it still happened. I did one study, for example, that showed that for a random sample of newspaper real estate ads in Philadelphia, that if the person called up to inquire about the availability of housing, and they spoke with a black accent, they were much less likely to get a response, much less likely to have their calls returned, much less likely to have access to any kind of housing. And it was structured by neighborhoods. So it was particularly true in white neighborhoods and mixed neighborhoods. So discrimination is still ongoing. During the Trump administration did everything possible to scale back civil rights enforcement on all fronts. One interesting thing is that the Fair Housing Act, when it was passed in 1968, had something called an affirmative mandate of the Fair Housing Act. And that is that the government had an obligation to make sure that municipalities were behaving in a non-discriminatory fashion. And it called upon the Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, to write regulations to enact this. And the first HUD director after the 68 Act was George Romney, Mitt's father. And George Romney was a racial liberal. And he was former governor of Michigan. And the United Auto Workers was one of the few unions that was always desegregated and egalitarian. And he was very conscious of civil rights and very strongly promoted civil rights. And so he started to write regulations to enforce the Fair Housing Mandate that would basically have forced municipalities getting federal funds from HUD to measure segregation, and if it's high, to come up with ways of promoting integration or risk their losing their federal funding. And of course, this was running against President Nixon's Southern strategy and a strategy of appealing to blue-collar voters in the North who were resisting affirmative action in employment markets. And so he basically quashed it and eased Romney out of the position. And no president had ever tried to enact the Fair Housing Mandate in subsequent administrations until the second Obama administration. The second Obama administration wrote these regulations and was starting to implement them. But then when Trump came into office, he rescinded them all. And Republicans floated legislation in Congress, sponsored by the leaders of the House and the Democrat and the House and the Senate Republican caucuses, to forbid the federal government from publishing data on racial, linking race to property levels and property values. They wanted to bury the data that you need to enforce the civil rights law. That never became law, but the Trump administration did quash affirmative housing mandate, and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development said that enforcing anti-discrimination was not part of HUD's mission. He took it out of the mission statement and pulled back on anti-discrimination enforcement. Now we have a Biden in office, and Marcia Fudge is former black representative in Congress, and she's the head of HUD, and I think she's moving forward to reinstate the affirmative mandate and the regulations, and empowering, to the extent possible under the law, mechanisms of fair housing enforcement. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have one question about what Jay Risk wrote in the chat window. He wrote, the Nehemiah Homes project, 6,000 housing units in East Brooklyn, are an outlier among Black housing foreclosures in the 2008 mortgage crisis. Less than 1% foreclosure. See Industrial Areas Foundation, a Nehemiah project for details. So, Professor Massey, would you like to comment on it? Or
well, I don't know that particular housing project. I'd have to find out more information. Projects are usually not owned housing, although there was a privatization effort during some of the Republican administrations to turn rental housing into owned housing, but I don't know the circumstances surrounding it. I did do an analysis in New Jersey of a affordable housing development that grew out of a state court case in New Jersey that produced the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which states that in New Jersey, it is unlawful to write zoning regulations that preclude the construction of affordable housing in a community. And I did an analysis of the housing, the development that came out of that lawsuit and that principle. And it's in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and it's called the Mount Laurel Doctrine. And 140 units of fully affordable housing, 90% Black or Latino, in the middle of Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which is a white affluent suburb of Philadelphia, across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. And we did an analysis of it, and we found, and these are not owned homes, these were rented homes. And what we found is that people who moved into the project, when compared to a propensity score matched sample of people who already selected into the list of people who wanted to get into the project, but were still on the waiting list. They're all self-selected. So we kind of controlled for selectivity, and basically compared to the comparison group, these people got to move from poor neighborhoods in Trenton and Camden and Philadelphia into an affluent suburb, even though the whole project itself was were people that were less than median income. They all experienced a huge boost in their upward mobility. The job rate, the employment rates rose, mental health improved, earned income increased, welfare dependency declined, and the children got access to a much better school system and did remarkably well in the school system. And so that's a demonstration for what these kinds of housing mobility projects can sometimes achieve. The other big housing mobility program that was tested was the Moving to Opportunity experiment that started under Clinton and finished under George Bush II. And the initial the initial results were not as promising as people had hoped, but the later results by Raj Chetty, economist at Harvard, showed that for kids who moved out of poor neighborhoods into lower poverty neighborhoods, and these were by no means really advantaged neighborhoods because of the design of the project, lower poverty neighborhoods, if they got there when they were young, really before they were in their teens, and experienced poverty, lower rates of poverty while growing up, they had higher rates of high school graduation, higher rates of college graduation, and higher lifetime incomes about 15 years later. So, Ross Chetty and myself and other sociologists like Rob Sampson at Harvard and Pat Sharkey, who's at Princeton with me, are showing that neighborhoods have an outsized effect on your life chances. And if you're born into and grow up in a very poor and disadvantaged neighborhood that's racially isolated, your life chances on almost any dimension are substantially reduced. And that in the study that I did looking at neighborhood income as opposed to family income as a predictor of lifetime earnings, we found that neighborhood income, the effect of neighborhood income was 70% of the effect of family income. So that's a big effect, and it made a huge difference in lifetime earnings. So neighborhoods are emerging as a real nexus for the transmission of poverty and the transmission of disadvantage as well as advantage. If you're born and raised in an advantaged neighborhood, you have a head start. If you're born and raised in a very disadvantaged neighborhood, you don't have a head start. You have a barrier. And we know that class segregation in the last several years, as inequality has increased, so has segregation by income. And that's produced concentrated poverty at the bottom and concentrated affluence at the top. And that's become a main focus of the transmission of advantage and disadvantage in the US today.
Thank you. Jake?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just had a quick question on the banking regulations we saw post-financial crisis and its effect on segregation. With Dodd-Frank, was there anything directly towards or that had impacts on the trends in segregation in neighborhoods? And then also recently, even the deregulation, like the economic growth, regulatory relief, consumer protection acts that went through in 2019, I know, or 2018, I think, had stuff in there about being able to bury the data, essentially, right? If you're a bank under a certain size, you didn't have to report on who you were lending to and those types of things, and some of the implications on the regulation or deregulation post 2010 on segregation.
Yeah, that was part of the war on civil rights enforcement that was across the board in the Trump administration, and it really bothered me when they tried to put place of birth in the Census Bureau, in the census, put citizenship in the census questionnaire. And their excuse was they wanted to do it to enforce civil rights legislation, which you knew was absolutely absurd in the Trump administration. That's the last thing they wanted to do. It's hard to say what the effects have been. I'm looking forward. I'm planning on doing a whole raft of studies based on the 2020 census and trying to get at what happened in the past decade, because a lot of things changed. We know that the foreclosure crisis hit Black neighborhoods hard, and one of the places that was hard hit was a place like Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed. He was one of the first Black Lives Matter examples. And what happened was Ferguson was a white suburb, but not a very wealthy white suburb, and middle-class Blacks were moving in and buying houses there. And it was a racially mixed suburb, but it still had white police officers and a white administration. And then when the foreclosure crisis, and because these were middle-class Blacks and had homes and were buying homes, they were put into subprime lending. And then when the mortgage crisis hit, the housing bust hit, and home values dropped, there was a raft of foreclosures in the neighborhood in Ferguson, Missouri. And because property values fell so dramatically because so many homes were foreclosed, budget shortfalls resulted. and the police were ordered to go out and make more traffic stops to make up the budget shortfall with tickets. And so they began to victimize Black drivers. And this is the context in which Michael Brown met the officer in Ferguson, Missouri on that day. So there was growing hostility between Black residents and the police. And then as the foreclosure crisis spread, financial firms pounced and went in and bought up all kinds of housing that was foreclosed upon in places like Ferguson, and then turned them into rental properties and used them to back securities. And so basically Black homeowners were forced out of their homes in Ferguson, New Jersey, Ferguson, Missouri, and then their homes were bought up by financial outfits that turned them into rental properties to back other securities, and then they were renting the houses they formerly owned in Ferguson, and that created a lot of enmity. And there's been very little done to regulate mortgage-backed securities, and mortgage-backed securities are coming back, and there's evidence that predatory lending was on the rise under the Trump administration. And securities were actually expanding into payday lending and car loans with usurious terms in lending packages. So the financial industry still, through Trump's administration, was still quite predatory and picking on minorities.
Thank you. Sharon?
Hi, I'm almost currently a sophomore, I'm sorry. Okay, so my question to you was, you've been mentioning a lot about like the geography of like racism and segregation, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the current phenomenon of gentrification, because I know that's like kind of like a newer thing, but there's obviously like a lot of circumstances and different types of outcomes from that type of issue. So I wanted to see what type of like information you have of that and like the potential outcomes of that type of issue.
Well, gentrification is the thing that's happening in a small set of cities, very wealthy cities, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. These are global cities that are well connected to the global economy, and inner city living has become popular. At least it was before the pandemic. We'll see what happens after the pandemic. And wealthy, affluent white neighborhoods were expanding into minority neighborhoods and displacing Black residents who couldn't afford to live there. So Harlem is increasingly being gentrified and prices are rising. And when I gave a talk at Columbia a couple of years ago, I was put in a hotel in downtown Harlem, which never would have been done 20 years ago. And I talked to the people working behind the bar and said, where'd you grow up? Harlem. Where are you living now? Teaneck, New Jersey. I can't afford to live in Harlem anymore. But even though gentrification is happening and Harlem is a racially mixed place now, New York is still hyper-segregated. It hasn't affected the overall level of segregation. Same is true in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is no longer majority Black. It's now minority Black. And parts of Washington, D.C. have gone affluent, that were destroyed in the riots, have been rebuilt as affluent white neighborhoods now. But Washington, D.C. is still a hyper-segregated metropolitan area. Prince George's County has become the place where African Americans increasingly live outside the district, and compared to Montgomery County, it's not an affluent place. It has a lot of pockets of poverty, and it's more vulnerable. So gentrification is happening. It's not solving the problem of integration or desegregation. It's displacing poor minority families from some neighborhoods, but it's not frequent enough or widespread enough to really make a dent in the overall patterns of segregation that we observe, at least until this point.
Thank you. Arvin?
Professor Massey, thank you very much. What about the changing nature of immigration and the impact that it has on residential segregation? We know that unlike 100 years ago, most immigrants, or at least a significant amount of immigrants, no longer reside in so-called gateway cities. So immigration is more and more impacting smaller areas around the United States. But I don't know, of course, we also know that immigration is far more socioeconomically diverse than it used to be 100 years ago. And some of our knowledge on this is actually from your work, obviously. But I don't know what the distribution, how that socioeconomic diversity intersects with destination of settlement of these immigrants. And I don't know how the pandemic or the Trump administration policies towards immigration, what's your predictions about the future and its possible impacts on segregation?
Well, the new destination phenomenon in immigration is largely something that is limited to Latinos, and especially to Mexicans and Central Americans. Caribbean Hispanics tend to go into central cities, although Puerto Ricans are moving out of New York, and they're no longer I think Dominicans are bigger than Puerto Ricans in New York now. But anyway, the movement into smaller areas in states that never had immigration really before, like Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Nebraska, Iowa. These are places where the Latino populations are growing most rapidly. And it's mainly Mexicans and to a lesser degree, Central Americans. And there, the big factor is the fact that a big chunk of these people are undocumented. And undocumented and being out of status has become under increasing pressure from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and from state and local people that are enticed into enforcing U.S. immigration law by incentives created by 287G of the 1996 legislation. And so it turns out that it looks like a high percentage of undocumented migrants in a community is a deterrent to integration, as you might expect. They feel safety in numbers in living in Latino neighborhoods rather than out in suburban neighborhoods. Although Hispanics do have more access to suburbs than Blacks do. And Black immigration is also affecting the Black community, but they tend to move into central cities rather than smaller towns. And they tend to move into Black neighborhoods or areas that are adjacent to native-born Black neighborhoods and have relatively high levels of segregation compared to other groups. And the big question is what happens to the second generation of Black immigrants and where they end up. And that's still kind of an open story because the second generations are still quite young. But I've just finished a book looking at the composition of the future Black elite by looking at a sample of African Americans, Black students at selective colleges and universities in the United States. And that population is very diverse with respect to immigrant origins, with respect to racial origins, with respect to class origins, and respect to origins in segregated versus integrated backgrounds. And it may be that the second generation immigrants may be able to improve their neighborhood circumstances, but it's too early to really tell. We'll have a better look when we get the 2020 census data. But for Latinos, the big thing seems to be the fact that about 30% of the Latino population is undocumented.
I do not see any more questions. We are right on time, 1 minute plus, but Christina can end the meeting.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here and for your questions, and thank Dr. Massey for his time, for his entire visit here to HWS. We're really excited to have you. I also want to thank you for the important work that you do. I think that it's not only is it something that has benefited us as scholars and public policymakers, but I think that you've done real work that has positively affected the citizens in this country through your work with the fair lending lawsuits and probably a whole host of other things that I know nothing about. So I just wanted to give you my appreciation for that work. And some of us will see you tomorrow.
Okay, I have a couple more engagements tomorrow that I'm looking forward to, and I thank everyone for their attention tonight and look forward to finishing my visit.